Well, hello and welcome to everyone, and thanks very much for joining us here on this, the final session of a 3-day conference. My name is Ishbel Smith from Heart and Mouth, and delighted to welcome you to this. And thanks very much for making the choice to remain here at the end and for being part of the whole event. Over the last 3 days, we've been hearing a lot about what others think choice does, what choice can do, and what choice should look like. We've been talking about how to enable, how to understand, and how to offer choice within the work that we do. And today in particular, we've been hearing about the theory and the practical realities of making hard choices and how that helps us make decisions or prevents folk from having the freedom of choice that we all expect to have. This closing session is going to help us explore that idea. Freedom of choice. What do we mean by it? What is the science of it means, and how understanding that may help change lives. But before I introduce you to our conversationalists this afternoon, I'd like you to take a moment to think about what you believe choice means. Do you think that everyone gets a chance to make equal choices? Do you think that everyone chooses to make the decisions they take every day? From what kind of breakfast to have, what kind of box set, which one to view, or whether to stay or leave a dangerous domestic situation, or whether to bed down for the night in a place that is inherently not a home. What choices, what decisions are made every day, and what freedom of choice is there to make them? Choice is often talked about as if it is something that is free for all. What do you think? Here's a few quotes which my glamour assistant David is hopefully going to throw up on the screen just now. I don't dare play around with the system. Have a look at these from a few famous people and famous films. What do you think choice makes? I should point out that the famous "if you have a choice, take both." Only one person here will recognise that's my family saying. Excellent if you have a buffet and there's lots of stuff that you want to grab from the table. If you have a choice, take both. But what extent do you agree with these quotes? To what extent do our choices show us who we truly are? To what extent are choices mistakes? And to what extent do we choose the path we go down on? Whether we agree with them or whether we don't, how our understanding of choice is informs what we do. Have a think about what you think, and now have a listen to what others think as well. David, you could take the picture down just now. So to help us think about choice, I'm delighted to welcome 3 members and co-founders of the Trauma Aware Law Group. We're going to listen into a conversation between them about how the understanding of trauma has affected and evolved not just what they do, but also has had a real impact on the criminal justice system. Feel free to comment any time in the general chat on what they're saying. We'll try and pick up some of your comments and ideas, or of course, ask questions in the Q&A session. We'll be keeping an eye on that as we talk. There may or may not be time for a Q&A at the end, but I'll try and feed them in as we go along. For those of you that don't know the 3 faces that are looking at you just now, they are, as I say, members of the Trauma Aware Group. They have a mixed background, but they are steeped in the criminal justice system. And in the last year together, with these 3 and the 2 other members, it's Tony Bone and James Docherty, have done a huge amount to help people understand the impact of trauma as it manifests within the criminal justice system, particularly in Scotland, but they have had an impact across the world. They have spoken to every law school in Scotland. They have spoken to many, many high schools, including developing a programme for every higher modern studies class in Scotland. They have convinced the Law Society to dedicate a half-day training at the annual law conference on trauma, and they have procured a bespoke accredited trauma course for all lawyers in Scotland. Their campaign has been influential in the recent decision by the Scottish Sentencing Council to make guidelines that show that right at the centre, front of centre, is trauma for young people, and that is for up to the age of 25 years. They've had a real impact. The three people that I have joining us today are Melissa Rutherford. Melissa is a director of Rutherford and Sheridan Solicitors and deals particularly with criminal, immigration and family law work. We have Kirsty Giles, who is an integrated psychotherapist and a national project manager with the Violence Reduction Unit. We also have Ian Smith, who is a partner at Keegan Smith Solicitors and has been practicing criminal law for over 25 years. When it comes to choices, I'd like to point out Ian is particularly good at making them, having chosen to marry me over 24 years ago. I'm sorry that James Docherty, who some of you were expecting to join us in this conversation, is unable to join us due to ill health. We wish him well. I know that this is a topic that he finds fascinating, and I know some of his ideas and experiences as an advisor with Criminal Justice Scotland and a mentor with the VRU will inform the discussion that you are about to hear. So, welcome everybody. Welcome to the conversation. It's good to see you. Throughout the day, as you hear, we've been, and throughout the whole conference, we've been thinking about choice. And Kirsty, I'd quite like to start with you because Professor Chang this morning reflected on a very structured and intriguing way to help people evaluate how to make hard choices. However, I'm really interested about how the science of trauma informs our understanding of choices. I'm sure a lot of the attendees here will consider themselves trauma aware, if not trauma informed. But I think a lot of that comes from a health harming behaviour viewpoint rather than necessarily decision making science. So it'd be good to get your views on what the scientific basis of the impact of trauma is and what that means when considering people's ability to make free choices in terms of their behaviour and decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and it's lovely to see little tiny faces at the bottom. I hope you've had a really lovely couple of days. It's so complex to think about the science behind trauma, but the way that I'm going to do it, and my colleagues have heard this a lot before, whether I'm working with someone who's 5 or 95 in my therapy room, if they've experienced toxic stress, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, I like to explain the science in the same way to everybody, because I think it's really important that we explain this in a way that everybody can understand. So forgive me if it's a little bit simple. I use 3 animals, and I'm going to link that in with what I know or believe to be true about decision making and the types of behaviour that happen when you've experienced childhood trauma in particular. So the first part of the brain that's really important, I remember by the meerkat. I'm sure you've all bought insurance or watched television and know what meerkats are like. They're very hypervigilant. They go around in packs for safety, and they're always on the lookout for snakes and scorpions and terrible things that might happen. And the reason that I use the meerkat is because this is your amygdala, and your amygdala is one of the oldest parts of your brain, and it's responsible for your fight, flight, or freeze response. So a time when your amygdala would fire, if you haven't experienced a huge amount of trauma, is you're about to walk across the road and a bus comes and you jump back. So your brain has fired your amygdala, you've got cortisol and adrenaline running through your body, and you move, you physically move. So it's extremely important part of the brain that we need to have, and we've had to use for a long time. The next part that's really important is Hippie the elephant. It's your hippocampus, and it's really important for emotional memories. So that would be what happened last time I did this. Did it work? Was it the right thing to do? So another really important part of your brain is the hippocampus. And the third part I remember by the owl. And if anybody's watched Winnie the Pooh, you'll remember that the owl doesn't often say a lot, but when it does, it's very wise. And the owl is Professor Owl because it's your prefrontal cortex. So this is the front part of your brain, and it's actually the last bit to develop as we are as humans today. The prefrontal cortex is where your rational and logical decision making happens. Now, your brain works best when all parts of it are working together. Your amygdala is in the background, just checking that everything's okay. Your elephant hippocampus is online saying, how are we feeling? What's going on here? And your prefrontal cortex is absolutely online because it's your rational and logical decision making. Now, what we know about the science of trauma and what it does to the chemistry in your body is that it switches your meerkat on constantly. And we know that if your meerkat is switched on, your amygdala is firing, your owl flies away. So your prefrontal cortex is not online at the same time that your amygdala is. And we see this in behaviours with children all the way through to adults. So, children in school that can't sit still, they throw things around the class, they shout out. We have adults that pace a lot, especially adults that we work with in the criminal justice system. They can't make eye contact. They look around at every bang. It happens a lot with children that are brought up in domestic abuse. If a door slams, it can re-trigger an experience of something that might have happened at home. And now when it comes to decision making, and being able to control your behaviours, if your amygdala is constantly firing, if you are in constant fight, flight or freeze, and your part of your brain that deals with rational and logical decision making is not on, then for me, in my line of work, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not scientifically trained, but what I see happen is that the capacity to make the correct, or what we would say socially acceptable decisions, is very limited. And if you imagine what happens when you're in the car and you're driving and someone cuts you off, you have for me anyway, I have a flood of adrenaline. I feel like my vision narrows, I feel shaky, my palms are sweating. And if someone at that particular point in time was to say to me, I want you to sit here and write an essay, or I want you to focus on the board, it's simply not possible for me. And I haven't experienced a huge amount of childhood trauma and adversity. So in that particular moment, the way I like to understand it is that the people that I work with and the people that we work with in the VRU are in a constant state of hypervigilance. And so decisions that they make around coping strategies like drug taking or abusive behaviours can be because they have no capacity to access their prefrontal cortex. And it would have been really interesting to hear this morning, because it would have been great to be able to kind of tie that in with what you'd heard before. But from my perspective, that makes a massive difference in their capacity to make the right decision in life.
Mm-hmm. Do you think at the time then people aren't aware that they are making decisions? They just act out of what we would call instinct rather than rational choice?
Yeah, I think even deeper than that, I think that it's a constant hypervigilance around survival. There is no capacity to thrive in there. There's no capacity to reflect. And topped to that, if you come from a family that's unsafe, or you have an attachment disorder, for example, that's never been role modeled to you, and you don't know what you don't know. So we then have a society that judges and labels and boxes people up. And what Melissa, Ian and I and the rest of the gang try and do is not the soft approach. It's not about letting people away with bad behaviour. It's about regulating somebody so that we can get their prefrontal cortex back online and being able to try and help them recognise that the decisions that they have had to make, I would argue, haven't been safe and haven't been what society expects of them. And our job actually as a whole village is to try and understand this and then work towards a more compassionate approach to help people recognise that how do they get their prefrontal cortex back online? How do we help them to make better decisions based on the science?
That's really helpful, and it's really interesting what you're saying there, Kirsty, about how that relates to a society that judges. And that's had a real impact on real life. I'm sure many of the attendees here will have seen this on a regular basis, either with contacts with the criminal justice system. And Melissa, it's maybe useful to get your thoughts at that point about historically then how the criminal justice system sees the attitude of choice. It's quite a I should declare, of course, I was a lawyer myself for 20 years, and traditional and rigid are perhaps words that we apply far too often. Historically, how would you see in your career that comes to blame and judgment issues and how the justice system copes with that?
I'm not even sure it is wholly historic as well, Ishbel. I think it's current. Ian and I see on a daily basis the Criminal Justice Social Work reports, and it's all about planning offences and being responsible for their behaviour. These actions were made as a choice, and you'll hear sheriffs that we talk to say, yes, I understand all that you're saying about trauma. I get it, I understand, but it was their choice to behave in this manner, which means they absolutely don't get it. So that's a difficulty, I think, that we're facing, that some sheriffs believe they're enlightened and believe that they understand the science behind trauma, but when it comes to practice, they don't. And that's probably a fact that law is so old-fashioned, it's so rigid, it's so structured, it's everyone thinks they're doing the best, but they can't seem to get out of the way that they think, to push the boundaries, to open their minds and really understand something that's not law and statute. So I always say we have an absolute privilege to be with someone in court on the different side of the table, from them, to be the person that's representing them, to be their voice. We're the only ones that can push the justice system forward to say, no, that's not right. They didn't have a choice. You don't understand the science behind it, the fact that they have been in situations that have caused scientifically proven developmental impacts on their brain, which leads to their behaviour. And it's not as simple as a choice. I believe a choice is a luxury, and the people that we see have that choice.
Melissa, it's interesting that the reflection you've had about science. Do you think being able to use the language of science and evidence, which is something that the courts love, does that help in being able to convince sheriffs about it?
Yes, I think for the past few years that we've been banging our drum about this, we've kind of been, here they go again, it's just another fad. But now we've got, we're still here and we're still banging our drum and we're still demanding to be heard that, yes, maybe they are saying, well, there is scientific basis for it, it is proven, there is significant research from medical background and the kind of scientific psychology background that it has to be listened to. There's no way out. And I think we will look back in 20 years' time and be disgusted. We used to execute people in Scotland for offences. This will be the same. We're imprisoning people that shouldn't be in prison, and we will look back and be horrified. And it is embarrassing to be part of that system. So I think at least we now are doing something, hopefully, to change not only the judiciary but society's view, because it's everyone's responsibility.
It's great to hear your passion for that, and your passion as an advocate for that. Ian, as evidently the oldest person on this panel, you and I were trained many years ago, and you practiced for a long time, perhaps without the lens of trauma to be aware of. Can you maybe explain and discuss the change that's made in your practice, how understanding the science changed that, and what the outcome that's meant for your clients, particularly those that have experienced homelessness?
Yeah, so this happened around March 2018 for me. It was just the result of watching a film. I could have listened to Kirsty and probably learned the same thing, but I watched a film called Resilience. It's all about the scientific and biological impact of trauma and the health outcomes for people. I immediately gathered from what I watched that this was my clients, and I suddenly saw them in a completely different light. I never ever regarded Ned's junkies.
Ian, sorry, could you lean in a wee bit into your microphone? Just sometimes, yeah. Thanks.
So I never viewed my own clients as being Neds or junkies or scum, but I always thought that they chose a certain path. So, for example, that they chose to take drugs, or that they chose or allowed themselves to become violent in ways or lacking control. That was a choice. And obviously with the science that Kirsty's talking about and the things that Melissa's indicating, is that you look at people completely differently. There's an educationalist called Stuart Shanker. I say that Stuart Shanker talks about seeing a different child, you see a child differently. And it's really just, I view my clients differently as a result of the science of trauma, and that we don't have a choice in a lot of what we do. So in terms of being responsible for their behaviour, I realised that there was a bigger picture out there which was affecting what we're doing. So responsibility, as the judges always want to gather the people is really that they're not responsible, or as Kirsty says, they don't have the capacity to be responsible because of trauma. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I don't know if you're struggling.
Well, I was just, I can't see you, which is always a benefit for me, obviously. But can everyone else hear Ian properly?
For me, he's kind of going in and out. I can hear mostly, but he's going in and out.
Yeah, Ian, I'm going to suggest you maybe turn your camera off. Oh yeah, and then try it back on again.
Okay, is that any better?
That's a lot better. Yeah. Can you maybe just repeat the last wee bit of what you were saying this there about choice?
So in order to, for me, the science and information, it allows you to realise that it's not a straight choice. That the issue of responsibility, which is key for all judges, that they want people to be responsible for their offences, and they don't want to minimise them. So what Melissa and I are talking about every day is not excuses for behaviours, but explanations for behaviours. And about capacity, that really what we're talking about here is responsibility, but for people who are not response-able, because they don't have that capacity, and therefore their culpability or blameworthiness is less than normal. Now, it doesn't give you carte blanche. I mean, judges will say to Melissa and I, "Oh, Miss Rutherford, it seems like all your clients have got trauma," and you have to explain to them, no, Sheriff, that's not true. It's not just our clients. It's nearly all the clients across your court. In your prisons, 80-90% of them will have massive adversity in their childhood and growing up. That these are warehouses for traumatized people in prison. And we don't respond well. We look at retribution and punishment as the go-to in Scotland, when in fact we should be looking at repair and rehabilitation if we understood properly the issues of trauma. That is why Scotland has the highest prison population in Western Europe and one of the highest drugs death rates in the world, because we do not look properly at the people we deal with. We look, I don't think judges do, but generally we look at people who are homeless, who are addicted to drugs or alcohol, as scum, as junkies, as less than us. When in fact, if we know and scratch the surface of backgrounds with people, we should be a lot more compassionate. We should be empathetic. We should give people hope. We should provide assistance, care, love, rather than the horrors that we see in prison and in the justice system of indifference to people's lives. And unfortunately, that's what's happening. There is a bit of a sea of change. The guys that I'm working with below, and James, Stephen Bennett as well works with us, Tony Bone, Nadine, Martin, there's a whole host of us, and people in education who are trying to raise awareness, because a wee bit like what Kirsty says is, what you don't know, you don't know. So for judges, they don't know about trauma. And what we've got to hope is that they're educated in that way, because they're about to bring in a whole bunch of guidelines by the Sentencing Council to tell judges that they must take account of people's trauma who are under 25 in sentencing them. The first problem is, A, they're not educated or understand about trauma. So in some ways, when they're imposing these uneducated decisions, it's because they don't know. But they have the choice, unlike many people in the system. Their choice is to know or not to know. They can't ignore this. This is stuff that's out there. It's been out there for a long time. So if they don't know, they shouldn't be doing their job, in my view. But they're about to be educated in that probably come November. And thereafter, the second difficulty in saying we will take into account trauma, we will realise that there's not a straightforward choice, is then to have the resources and places for people to be sent to for repair, for rehabilitation, which at the moment is not systematic, because the system at the moment is based on punishment, restriction of liberty orders, community payback orders of unpaid work, of fines. We don't have a sentence to get people therapy, or to get people into education, or to give people homes, or to help people get their financial situation sorted out. That's not what we do, but it would be the smartest thing to do if we could do that. Anyway, that was a very long answer to quite a short question.
No, but and I know that there's so much that can be said about this, but you've used the word should a lot. This should happen, this should happen. And very often to convince people it should happen is because there's examples of where it has worked before. So I'd be interested to hear from all three of you, from your perspectives, times where you've seen where this science has informed a change, be that in a client, be that in someone you're working with, or be that in a sheriff, that has had a direct impact, a story that we can pull on as evidence. So all three of you share the stories of where sharing this knowledge doesn't just should work, but has worked in the past. Maybe Kirsty, we could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about some of the projects that we do in the Violence Reduction Unit. We work a lot with people with offending histories, and we provide them with employability and wraparound support and group work and psychotherapy. And we now know that it's not just about giving people a job. You have to help them heal and help them do the inner work. And it's interesting because one of the biggest learnings for me is not that you need a huge budget, and it's not that you need a huge group of academics around the table. It's that you have to bring a high dose of hope, because there's a lethal absence of that in people's life who've experienced trauma and who've come a lot of the time being beaten up rather than brought up. And one of the projects that we have at the moment, we looked across the country, and we couldn't really see many organisations looking into what we call desistance mentoring. So how do we bring people, young people, 18 to 25-year-olds who have experienced a lot of trauma and have had their own experiences in the criminal justice system? When you ask them what they would like to do, very few of them say, oh, construction or scaffolding. And that's where they're placed, because it's a forgiving trade. You don't need a PVG. I think what we forget is that some of the most traumatized people in our country are some of the most resilient, because they've had to be. And they've often been parents before they were children, been parenting their own parents for a long time. And when you ask them what they want to be or who they want to be, they often say, I want to help people. I want to give back. And so we have a program whereby we're training up young desistance mentors, and it is magical what these young people can do, because they have walked in the shoes of the people that they are supporting. And similar to James Docherty and Callum Hutchison, they have kudos in every room, in every prison, in every children's care home. And if you give somebody the opportunity to help people heal when they've done their own healing, we often say hurt people, which I think is true, but healed people go on to heal other people. So this isn't just a story of one starfish at a time, although that's really important. It's recognised that when you, and I'm sure Ian will finish with his starfish story, I'm just giving you a wee taster. When you save one starfish, that starfish goes on to save loads more. So we have to harness that, and we have to believe that not only are you changing somebody's life, but when you give them an opportunity to help and to support other people because they've lived it and they know it, then that's where magic happens. And we have to get much better at recognising the strength of these people, as opposed to judging the decisions that they most of the time didn't have a choice in making.
It's not often in conferences like this that you hear phrases like high doses of hope and magical and magic. And the hope is such an important emotion, because it is how communities heal itself. And I'm hoping that people that are participating in that get that magic, because that's what stories can do, is inspire people for change. Ian and Melissa, I know that you've got lots of stories where you have been able to inspire change. Melissa, is there anyone that jumps to mind initially?
Yeah, there's one that I can think of. It was a girl, age 14. She first came to me for children's referral proceedings. Nothing had ever happened before, and she started getting into kind of low-level community disturbances, started drinking alcohol. Very quickly that escalated through to Sheriff Court summary, and soon thereafter into multiple petition levels crime, which is solemn proceedings before a sheriff and jury. Very, very serious matters for such a young girl. She spent a lot of time in the secure part of the Good Shepherd Children's Unit and graduated, unfortunately, up to Cornton Vale, where she spent a significant period of her young life. I moved firms and moved away from her story, but I still kept in touch with her family through Facebook. Her mum would message me and let me know how she was getting on over the years, and she messaged me to say she was out of prison, she had a house, she was managed to get a job in youth work because they understood and they wanted her as a role model, really, because she'd managed to put the offending behind her. I then got a phone call more recently to say that she was involved in quite a serious matter. When I met her at court, it was possession, and it was a trigger offence. Something had happened that had triggered her past. She had been she'd been raped by her stepfather, and also witnessed significant domestic violence against her mother growing up. As a result, that was really the trigger to all of her problems. The thing that brought her back was she had overheard someone screaming and saying "stop it," which brought back what she had gone through, and she confronted the male with a knife. Things escalated, the police were involved, and she ended up in court for quite a serious matter. When this came to court, we spoke to the sheriff, and I explained her background to him. I explained this was a trigger. She'd been out of trouble for a number of years. She tried her absolute best. She was doing so well. She was in therapy. She had secured employment. She had secured a tenancy. She had a relationship and a little dog. And she was the best I'd ever seen her, ever, since she was 14. She's now, I think, 22. So he agreed and gave her a community-based disposal, which that was in January. This is now October, and there's been no further offending. And she has been in touch with people to regain employment through the youth work, because unfortunately, due to the pending court case, she lost it. But hopefully she will get back into some sort of work. So that is a story that a practical difference is made to a really young girl who has, on paper, a really bad record and doesn't have a chance, but she absolutely does. And that's a sheriff that did and has made a difference to her life.
Do you think it was that the sheriff heard that she didn't have a freedom of choice when she heard that shouting and acted in the way that she did?
The way I explained it was the way she explained to me. So I didn't try to make it legal jargon or jazz it up. I said this is what she thought was happening, and on a background of that having happened to her when she was 14, she was alarmed. Her body went into overdrive, and this was her immediate reaction. And yes, it is wrong, and now she can see it is wrong, but at the time she wanted to save that lady. Maybe it was going back to thoughts of her being in that position if someone had done the same for her. I don't know. She didn't say that part, but that was my understanding, and it was very emotional. I remember being very emotional talking to the sheriff about it, and I think that he understood that she needed a chance, because it was out of character for her now, so it wasn't something she had actively chosen to go and do.
I can really hear the emotion in your voice talking about it, and also the power of what you're saying, that you used her voice, her words, rather than some kind of legalistic, jargonistic, it's trauma. Because I think some people wonder if there's a danger of overuse of the trauma jargon to a certain extent, and that you only want the courts to see the trauma rather than the individual. So the power of using our own voices, I suspect, addresses some of that. So thanks for sharing that. Ian, what about you? You've got loads of stories.
I'll try and just cut me in my prime if I go on too long, but I'll try and focus on a couple of stories just to illustrate really what we see and what potentially the advocacy that we do or the stories that we tell can make a difference in court. So one is for a young lad, we'll call him Brendan, not his real name. He was on a community payback order, went chaotically out of control and breached the order. So when he appeared at Edinburgh Sheriff Court from custody, he had breached the order by not cooperating, communicating with the social work department. So that resulted in him being in a breach of this order. But what the judge was told by me was as follows, was that in terms of his background, he had a horrific background. So his mother consumed heroin from the time he was born. His father was never on the scene. mother had numerous partners going in and out of the house. He was being at least physically abused during that time, and he was in and out of care. So when mum was chaotic in her own life, he would get taken into care and then batted back towards her. And it was just chaos. So the stuff that Kirsty was telling you about at the beginning, he was flooded with stress the whole time in his childhood and having a terrible old time. So by the time he was 10, he started drinking. By the time he was 11, he was taking cannabis and other drugs. By the time he was 13, he was injected by his mother in his first shot of heroin. And thereafter, his chaotic life continued. By the time he was 16, he'd left care and he was in and out of hostels and otherwise. So when the judge is meeting him, age 17, he was in the grips of a chaotic lifestyle. But during the time when he stopped engaging with social work, he'd engaged with the Rock Trust, other agencies, including Aid and Abet, and they basically took him under their wing and mentored him. So by the time he was appearing in custody, he had managed to start the road of turning his life around. So he'd managed to get through the Rock Trust, a house. He got a general practitioner's prescription. He was getting drug rehab. Aid and Abet were mentoring him. He was engaged with benefits. So all these great things were happening to him. And I'd explained this in detail to the judge, who it turned out was at university with me. She wasn't a friend, but someone I knew. And she looked down at me and looked at this little waif of a boy. He was small, he was thin, but he was just clearly just a wee boy. And she said, "What are you asking me to do with him?" And I said, "Well, I've told her all these great things that he's done, how he's turning his life around." I thought, stuff in for a penny. I said, "I want you to praise him." She's like, "Sorry?" I thought she hadn't heard me. I shouted it out in his busy court. "I want you to praise him." And she was a bit taken aback and said, "Praise him, I'm going to remand him in custody." I said, "Well, don't do that. I've just told you all these things that he's done." So she allows him bail. 4 weeks pass, and we come armed with all these reports from Aid and Abet, from the Rock Trust, from the housing officer, from the social worker, from his doctor, all the things that I had said he was doing now, but equally importantly, in the background report, where they normally whisper about trauma, it was there in black and white about this boy's appalling upbringing, about all the trauma and horrors that he had suffered, about the track and pathway for him to get involved in heroin. And as I entered court and I gave the judge the reports, she told me to sit down, not to speak. And what magic happened, as Melissa says, and Kirsty says, the magic can happen. And the magic was the judge spent 10 minutes praising this boy about the efforts he had made, her recognition about how hard his life had been, which I think she initially couldn't see. And at that stage, she allowed the order to continue and wished him well. And as we both went out, I had tears in my eyes. We both went out. He said nobody in authority had ever spoken to him that way. And for me, it was a piece of magic, and I wish I could bottle it so I could say to every sheriff in Scotland, say, look at this epiphany for the sheriff who couldn't see the person who was before him until she could clear her eyes. And that's what happened. And my one regret with it is I didn't go back and say to the sheriff, just so you know, you've made that boy feel special. You've made him feel good about himself, because he's never felt good about himself. And he's still on a pathway. It won't be straightforward, as you know, in working in homelessness. That there's no miracle cure. So I know that. But I think it's really important to start early. And the next example I'll give you is a sheriff who retired after 18 years. And she had this girl going in and out of her court for 18 years. And every time she appeared, she realized the girl was struggling. So she was involved in drugs. She had mental health issues. She was in and out of prison. She was stealing to fund her habit. And she saw her from the first day that she was a judge. And the last day, 18 years later, this girl was back in her court and still struggling. And the judge decided to get off the bench where she sat, took her wig off, took her gown off, and she hugged her. And she told us all this in a speech, a wee bit like this talk. And she says, "Has anyone got any questions at the end of the talk?" Because it's quite an emotional thing for a judge to do. And I put my hand up and I said, "What do you think the girl's life would have looked like if he had hugged her the first day rather than the last day?" And the judge felt terrible about that because she knew immediately what I was saying. Not that she would actually have physically hugged the girl the first time, but if actually she'd shown a bit of compassion, a bit of care, a bit of recognition that this girl who was hurt and damaged didn't choose to live the life of a heroin addict, of homelessness, that actually if she could see that she could have made that difference, or that we, me and Melissa, in terms of our job, and Kirsty as a psychotherapist who can actually make a difference to people, you in terms of people who care about people who are struggling with homelessness, with their mental health every day, you do that job every single day. If we can start doing these things early, why wait 18 years or 20 years or a lifetime before we start helping people, before we start showing them love and care? And I think that's been the biggest epiphany for probably Melissa and I, is that we do this early. Economically, it's a horror show for Melissa and I because we make money out of people's misery, but we can't do that anymore. So we try and signpost them. Melissa and I, we can't do what Kirsty does or what you guys do in terms of what you understand about people, but we can signpost people, and that's what we do. So that probably, it's two examples. I've got hundreds of others, but I'll let other people in, let Ishbel come back in with a question.
I think I've seen a few clapping hands for that, Ian, and it's clear from all three of you the emotion and the personal commitment that you have in order to make the changes in people's life, and the personal commitment you're asking other people to make. And I know, as you say, Ian, loads of people on this conference will be listening to this talk later are personally involved and really care about making a difference in people's life. But I think what we'd be interested in exploring with you three is that you're not just making a difference on individual clients, which is to be lauded and applauded, but you are making a difference within the system. And it's probably picking up slide. See that Derek Holiday's asked this question about who needs to be involved to do this. And it can get frustrating when you care to only save one starfish at a time. You can tell that story later if you want, Ian, or not. But how do you start making the sea change? In order for the environment to change, you are doing things that are making impact. The sentencing guidance that you've mentioned earlier is changing things, not just for your clients, not just for the people that VRU engage with, but for us as a society. What tips and techniques do you suggest make an impact that people here might share with, particularly within the homeless environment, to allow people to make those steps to hug at the start of 18 years rather than at the end?
Well, for me, I'll just continue on that theme. Really, is that for we as a group, individually, we do what we say we do every day. So in court every day, where it's applicable, where it's important, where it's relevant, we will talk about the trauma that people have suffered and the lack of choice that they actually have because of this phenomenon. So every day at grassroots level, that's what we do. So we do a bottom-up approach of this is what we preach to people who, for example, you guys working in homelessness and mental health and addiction and in the criminal justice system. So we reach out to people at what's effectively grassroots level and encourage them to do what they can where they are effectively. And that's what we do as practitioners. So we try and lead by example in terms of what we do. And John Carnochan calls that a bottom-up approach, and he says that's essential. So a long time ago, about 3.5 years ago when I met him, he says it must be grassroots, bottom-up, because you will not affect change at the top down. For me, we've tried to do that both ways. So at the bottom-up, we're trying to encourage everyone to do the sort of trendy name trauma-informed practice. Probably none of us particularly like that, because what Tony talks about is we all need to be trauma responsive. It's all very well, you could have this knowledge, but if you're going to do absolutely hee-haw about it, then you're wasting everyone's time. What you've got to do as professionals is change how you change your behaviour. But what we also attack is a top-down approach, which is we're targeting the judges, we're targeting the sentencing council, we're targeting politicians, we're targeting the Judicial Institute who train every judge in Scotland. Melissa's targeting, for example, in Glasgow Sheriff Court, the sheriff principals to say, can we come in and talk to you about this? So that when they get it, it comes down the way, because literally it's got to happen across the board. Because if you don't have a systemic change, it's probably not going to work. Because if they don't get it at the top, we will just be throwing stones at the system. So we take a very proactive approach and we persevere. and we've had a lot of disappointments on the way, but we've had a lot of small wins. And we're speaking to you guys about what we are doing, not really to tell you by way of example, this is what it looks like in our world, but that translates into your world. It translates into schools, it translates into hospitals, to police stations, to prosecutors' offices, and to judges' offices. And hopefully we can just keep it going, but be relentless. I would say the biggest task is really to keep going, because there's some days you sort of feel like giving up. So this morning I had a terrible report for a young guy who have got into college, and he's doing brilliantly in college, but the social worker only puts X's at the times he's not turned up, rather than massive ticks when he does show up. And to say, well done, keep going, that's brilliant. And all this young guy hears from the social worker is, where have you been? Why were you not on time? Why did you fail to turn up? And the change really has to be how we see people.
It's that message of hope, isn't it? And it ties into what you were saying, Kirsty. You're inspiring people about the hope that things can change and the intersectionality of the work that you do. And I think that's why you use trauma-aware law help, because there's such intersectionality. Tony, I know, used to be a police officer before he became a lawyer, and Kirsty, you bring the science approach, and the VRU probably is one of the shining examples of intersectionality. Is there anything that you'd like to add to what Ian's said there?
Yeah, I think a couple of things I would say is we call it the heart and soul work, because I guess the quickest way to help people understand this is to reach their heart, which is why the stories are so powerful. And it is a real privilege to stand alongside people who've experienced that kind of trauma and watch them shine in life, and find partners and have children and parent well. It's an unbelievable privilege. But if you can't get people with the heart and soul work, then you can hit them with the economics. And adverse childhood experiences in the UK cost around about £10.7 billion. We simply cannot afford this anymore. It costs about £46,000 to £50,000 a year to keep someone in prison. Our rates of reoffending are extraordinarily high. So we have a system that's about to collapse. We have an NHS system that's on its knees. And if we could work together as a whole system approach at a multi-agency level to reduce adverse childhood experiences, we would then reduce addiction, which would then reduce crime, which would then have an impact on poverty and an impact on employability rates and the overall country's health. So we put a sticking plaster on everything when we don't focus on trauma. And like Ian said, we do a kind of middle out approach to things, and we are relentless. Ian in particular, we call him the ace-caped crusader. He's just absolutely gets us going with it, and we have some amazing successes. And here's the interesting thing. We keep asking frontline workers to do more. And we say, train yourself up in trauma, become trauma informed, and learn about ACEs and understand toxic stress. And what we don't recognise, I don't think, is that everybody is human and everybody has suffered, especially in the last 18 months. And regardless of how big your house is, how good your job is, how well your family have attached to you, pain is pain. And we shouldn't be asking people like social workers and health visitors and teachers to do more without recognising their well-being has to come first, which is why a systems approach and an organisational approach to trauma practice is crucial to this. You're not going to change the tide by having 2 or 3 workers who believe in the damage of adverse childhood experiences. You have to have senior management that not only understand it, but can help to regulate the staff, because we are all working far higher than capacity. And I think that's number one, is how are our staff doing and how do we look after them in order for them to be able to perform in a trauma-informed way.
That well-being, because the compassion in your voice and compassion in your approach is so apparent, Kirsty, and with all of you, but it is tiring to keep that level of compassion. I know that many of the people involved here will have that sense of tiredness. So I'm wondering, Melissa, what enables you to make the choice to continue to going on? You make it every day. You step into court and you make the choice that you'll continue to fight, that you continue to have this compassion for yourself and for your clients. What allows you to do that? And what choices do you make to enable that?
Once I found out about trauma and the impact that trauma has had on the people that I represent, I lost my choice. There's no way I could be a lawyer and have the privilege of being these people's voice in court and not address the trauma. So when things are overwhelming, when work is too much and all the other things that go on get on top of you, and you want to just ignore that email or not do another talk or not talk about trauma or ACEs or, try to change people's opinion, you just have to remember that the position that we have is a privilege. It absolutely is. It's something that if you're not going to do the job properly, you shouldn't be doing it at all. It wouldn't be fair of me to go into court to represent my clients and to not be so passionate about what has happened to them. We deal with not only crime but also children's referrals, social work proceedings, things like that, and it's the same. It's the same people, the same problems, and the only way that we are making a change is by speaking to everyone involved in that process, and everyone in society has a moral responsibility to know about trauma and to do their best to make Scotland a society that understands and empathises with the people that have suffered trauma, and to make things better and easier and hopefully to change lives. And maybe it won't be in my lifetime, but I'm hoping it is.
What a wonderful thing it would be to see that, to in 20 years to look back, as you said at the start, to say I was part of that. And who can believe that we even had to have this kind of discussion? And it is this about everyone doing their best. And I think it picks up slightly on what Kirsty said at the start about a village, taking a village to raise a child, taking a village to change a system, and everyone doing their bit. And then it's less daunting, isn't it? It's not just Melissa, it's not just Ian, it's not just Kirsty, but it's everyone on this call, it's everyone that's going to listen in to do their bit. Not one person can change it, but we can all change it together. Our time's beginning to come to an end, and there's been some great comments, but just before we go, I suppose got one last question. We've been talking about choices. As in, what one choice would you like individuals or the system to make that you think would change things for that vision that you have of the future? Melissa, I'll start with you, go to Kirsty and then Ian. What's the one choice that you would like people to make now that you think would change things for better in the future?
Just think about trauma, talk about trauma, tell everyone that you know about what you've learned today, if you've learned anything new, and don't get down about it, because we can all do this together.
Thanks, Melissa. Brilliant. Think, talk and tell. Kirsty.
I'm going to end on one of my favourite quotes. I don't think anything's original in the world, and most of the best quotes have certainly been said, but Father Gregory Boyle has the biggest gang rehabilitation project in the planet in Los Angeles. And he says, "Here is what we seek, a compassion that can stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it."
I'd almost like to stop there, Ian, not to cut you, but yeah, nothing like Father Greg Boyle. He's amazing. And to stand in awe rather than judgment, and how appropriate within a criminal justice talk. Let's stand in awe more often. Ian.
I think, in a more clumsy way, but probably the same sentiment, is I'd like for us all to see, or to assume that people are good, and that assume that there may be hurt or heartache in their lives that maybe make them appear on the outward ways bad or poorly behaved or unkind. It was a phrase that Kirsty had introduced me to, that the hardest part, I guess, of all our jobs is to be kind to people who appear to be unkind. And I think in that regard, that I think what I would like everyone to do is to treat everyone with dignity and respect, even if they're difficult. And the people that me, Kirsty and Mel deal with on a daily basis, and that you guys deal with, who may be struggling with homelessness and mental health and addiction. They appear to be difficult, but they're the ones we need to love the most. And it can sometimes be hard, but to actually just that everyone did that. And I know it's an unrealistic goal, but that's what I would like.
To choose to love is a difficult choice to make, but it's a very powerful one, isn't it? Thanks. Okay, well, there's some great comments coming through, and it's just been brilliant as always. It's a privilege to be able to chat to you guys publicly, because I'm very lucky to be able to speak to you, even Ian, on a regular basis, and it's an absolute inspiration. I hope that you make the choice to see the difference that you've made, that to make the choice to continue to do the work that you are doing, because it is making such a real impact. And thank you for making the choice to join us today. I know that you're all busy. I know Melissa's into lecture more. I know Kirsty's running around, and I know Ian's still busy away in the office, even though he promised to take my daughter somewhere in 20 minutes. But anyway, that's a whole other discussion. So thank you, the three of you. And indeed, thank you to everyone. I think if you're able to clap, to press your clapping hands emoji to show your appreciation for the people of the Trauma Aware Law. Follow them on Twitter, follow their campaign, and I'm sure that they'd be more than happy to reach out to any and all of you to chat about how they might be able to work with and alongside you in the incredible work that everyone does. Unfortunately, time is working against us. We are not able yet to use our power of choice to freeze time and carry on these conversations as long as we'd like. But before we depart, I'd like maybe everyone to just take a moment and think. You've heard a lot in this session about judges and judgment. So maybe 3 questions. How often have you been judged for a so-called bad decision over which you've really had very little control? And have you judged yourself badly for that? How often have you judged people in the past through the choices that you see that they've made? And are you going to change your position on that as a result of what you've heard today? How has this conversation helped you see the role of trauma within the spaces and places that you live and work? And how might that help you to understand, explain, and adapt to that as you go forward? Certainly this afternoon has helped me do that, and the whole conference has helped. And it's been a great session to bring all the themes together. And thanks again to everyone. Huge thanks to Homeless Network Scotland for the opportunity to connect in this way and for hosting this platform, which, while it looks completely bewildering that you go onto it, actually does seem to work. So thanks to the team for all the effort that they've put into this and choosing this amazing theme. Thank you to all the speakers and contributors who chose to give their time, share their insights and their experience and expertise with everyone. I know that the videos will be available on the YouTube channel of Homeless Network Scotland, I think next week. So we'll be able to share the knowledge and share the insight that these people have given up. Thank you to the sponsors who chose to commit to this event and make it happen. I know it's been really worthwhile and will have a long-lasting impact. But most of all, thank you to you all for choosing to be here and for choosing to commit to being an active part and service to this community and to our society, which will make a difference. Thanks, everyone. I think our speakers may be lingering afterwards. When you go back into the room, you might have it so you could join them at the tables as we go in afterwards if you're wanting to linger on and have a chat with them specifically about that. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the session and enjoy sharing what you've learned today. Thank you.